If you're a beginner watercolor painter, or if you just want to improve your skills, here are 10 simple things you can do to improve your painting. The first tip is to draw a lot. I know this doesn't technically have anything to do with watercolor, but it's really important. If you don't have a strong foundation for your painting, then you're pretty much not going to get a great result. So I personally draw my dog, I draw my boyfriend, I draw anything that is in my sight. And thanks to lockdown, it's pretty much things inside my house at the moment, but that's okay. So, you know, even my feet, my hands, there's always something that you can draw. Here's just some things from my kitchen, and Winnie again asleep on the floor. Also, there's some really great books on drawing. This is one of my favorite ones, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which explains how you need to quieten the left rational side of your brain when you're drawing and instead tune into the right hand side, which is the creative and non-linguistic side of your brain. It's really interesting. You also want to practice perspective if you're going to be doing any landscape paintings, especially with lots of buildings in or in the city. It can be quite complicated, but it's really important to learn. So yeah, I would suggest just basically reading and watching as many videos as you can on perspective. The next tip is that paper is more important than brushes and paint. What I mean by this is that if you had some pretty terrible watercolor paper and some great brushes and great paints, you're probably still not going to get a great result. But if you have some really nice watercolor paper and some cheap brushes and some cheap paints, you probably could still get a pretty good painting. So if you're wondering where to spend your money, or if you want to spend a bit more and you can only afford to spend a bit more on one particular thing, I would suggest doing that with paper, because it's really going to affect the result. I also try and find 100% cotton paper. Like this Archer's paper has 100% cotton, which basically means it's made out of cotton. So it's not made out of wood pulp like normal paper, it's made out of cotton. And Saunders Waterford is my favourite brand, but it's really expensive. And I do a lot of my paintings in sketchbooks, so here are just a selection of some of my favourites. This first one is made out of 100% cotton. It's the Etchr Lab Perfect Sketchbook, and that is one of my favourites, but it's quite expensive, so I also have some others that I use. This is the Stillman and Birn Alpha Series sketchbook. It's supposed to be for light washes, but I actually can put quite a few washes on there and it does handle it quite well. This is also the Moleskine watercolor sketchbook, which is another great one that's also not 100% cotton, but it still handles washes pretty well. So the next tip is to use your paper towel. So this is about controlling the water that you have on your brush and making sure you've never got too much, because too much water on your brush can really affect your painting. At the same time, having not enough water on your brush can also be a problem. So it's really about learning to balance that, and it can take a while to get used to it. Mix on the paper is my next tip. This is basically a great way to get a nice variety in your colours, and I just find it produces a much more interesting result. So for example, here I'm just trying to get a grey for the chair, but I'm painting with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and they kind of just mix together on the paper, and I find that it just creates a much more fluid watercolory type effect, which is kind of what you want. You don't want to treat your watercolor paints like you would your oils and your acrylics, because it is a different medium, and the whole great thing about watercolor is that sort of washy blendy effect. So I try and mix as much as I can on the page. Obviously a lot of that is to do with knowing how your colours mix and how they blend together, but I'll get to that a little bit later. My next tip is to leave some white paper behind. This is pretty much the best way that you can get whites when you're doing watercolor painting. There are some other ways to get white, which I'll talk about in a bit, but if you're doing any large areas of white, for example white buildings like I did here, or I did white in the background here and also in these buildings, Again, I did it here in the right hand side where the snow is, and it's just a really nice way to get white into your paintings. The next tip is to make sure that you're using big enough brushes. So one of the worst things you can do is use a really small brush which can only hold a small amount of water, because then you're going to get a bitty effect and you're not going to be able to get that nice fluid watercolour effect. The next tip is to limit your palette. So you don't actually need that many colours really to make pretty much any colour that exists. So all you really need is a red, a yellow, a blue and a brown. Now there's loads of different types of those colours, so I could make a whole video just about that. Let me know if you want me to. But yeah, once you've got the right 4 of those colours, the 3 primaries and an earth tone, then you can pretty much paint anything you want, and it can also help achieve colour harmony in your paintings if you limit your palette, especially when you're starting out. It can be tempting to just paint with every single colour that exists, but it's actually more useful to limit the number of colours that you're using, but just know how to use them well. And you'll just find that your painting overall just looks a lot more harmonious and it sort of flows together nicely. You can use blue and brown, so I usually use ultramarine and burnt sienna to create a really nice grey, and that's useful in so many different areas. So I pretty much use those 2 colours the most, even though they might look a bit boring, but they're actually so useful once you come to doing your paintings and you'll start to notice that you're needing to use those colours all the time. My next tip is to make a mess. So the whole great part about watercolour is it's just very fun, and I think a lot of the time it can be tempting to sort of freeze up and get quite tight with your strokes, but that's probably one of the worst things you can do. It always looks better to just go a bit loose, I find, and for my personal style anyway. And yeah, this is just me demonstrating that in a bit of a weird way, but yeah. And also you can just clean up your messes and lift up the colour, so it doesn't really matter if you make too much of a mess. So tip number 9 is know your colours. So this is just about understanding the paints that you have, testing how each colour mixes with all the other colours. You'll find that different paints act in different ways on the paper, and also different paper will act on different ways with your paint. So you really just need to try out everything. Just make fun little splashy things like this, and every time you buy a new paint, then try it out with all the other paints that you have, and it's a really fun way to get to know your paints. So here I was just trying that with Cobalt Turquoise Light, which is a really nice blue colour. And here I was just testing out a few different sky colours and just seeing what colours I liked for the sky and making a few notes on them, so that's always helpful. My final tip is to go opaque. So this is all about using gouache, which is basically watercolour, but it's an opaque form of watercolour. So I used it here on the railing on the right, and before I finished that railing I felt like the painting was a bit of a mess, but it really brought the whole thing together. So it can be really helpful at the end of a painting to just go in with some very limited amount of highlights. So here I've just done them on the rocks. It really just brings your painting to life, but you don't want to overdo it, and also you only want to really do it right at the very end, because if you try and paint over the gouache with watercolour, it's probably just going to end up a bit of a mess and a bit muddy. And I used it here as well on the rocks, and I used it to make some little things. I don't really know what that's called. So hopefully you enjoyed these tips, and hopefully they were helpful and you can incorporate some of them into your own paintings. And just have fun with it. Don't be precious with your paints and just make a mess.